Hi everyone, and welcome to the next game from Bobby Fischer's My 60 Memorable Games. This time we're going to have a look at a game he played at the Varna Olympiad in 1962 against Austrian chess grandmaster Karl Robatsch, after whom the Robatsch opening is named. Robatsch was a superb chess player as well as a renowned botanist. He was the Austrian champion of the era and played first board for his national team on several occasions. Bobby Fischer, of course, needs no introduction. At the time this game was played, he was in his late teens and, like his opponent, a highly respected grandmaster. Fischer had the white pieces and opened, as always, with e4, to which Robatsch played d5, the Scandinavian defence, another of his pet openings, along with the Robatsch or modern defence with an immediate g6 here. He did a lot to revive this opening choice in the mid-20th century. Fischer continued with the main line e takes d5, where Robatsch played queen takes d5. A playable alternative is knight f6, which Fischer described as the modern way in the 1960s. From here, white has two ways to maintain his pawn. Firstly, with c4, which creates some weaknesses in the white position at d3 and d4, especially considering the black queen will soon be blasting down the d file, and black can continue with c6 and good compensation for the pawn already. Another way to hold the pawn is with bishop b5 check, and after the best move bishop d7, playing bishop c4, where he has avoided making concessions on the d file. Fischer gave a sample game he played at a tournament that continued as follows: bishop g4, f3, bishop f5, and now the aggressive g4. And after bishop c8, knight c3 to hold the d pawn, knight bd7, and now g5, kicking the knight, so knight b6, in the event of g takes f6 as knight takes c4. So bishop b5 check, forces knight fd7, and now f4, knight takes d5, exploiting a forking tactic after knight takes d5, and c6, and now after bishop c4, c takes d5, and bishop takes d5, white retains the pawn despite making these weaknesses on his king side, and from here Fischer's feeling was that the extra pawn should prevail and give white good winning chances. Okay, so back to the game continuation anyway. Queen takes d5 from Robatsch. And here Fischer played knight c3, which is developing with tempo because it attacks the queen. And this move is one of the reasons that the opening is not popular at top level, because at this moment two of the fundamental rules of the opening are broken. Those of moving the queen out early, and also of moving the same piece twice, because the queen is going to have to move again now, of course. And this latter rule is especially true after Robatsch's next move, queen d8, retreating the queen to its initial starting square, because now, after d4, white has had two moves for development, whereas black has simply traded off his d-pawn. It's a hypermodern approach, and Robatsch was aiming to give up the center and then play against it, which is a style he was content to utilize and, indeed, got great results using. The Scandinavian defense itself, which he's using here, is one of the oldest recorded openings as an alternative to simply playing symmetrically with e4 and e5, and the first recorded game is over 500 years old. Until quite recently it had been known as the center counter defense, but work by Scandinavian grandmasters, including the brilliant Bent Larsen, resulted in its renaming about 50 years ago. Robatsch's move here, queen d8, is the oldest main line. Alternatives are queen a5 and queen d6, amongst others, but queen a5 and queen d8 are considered the most sound. Despite that, it remains an opening where black must struggle for a long time before reaching equality, and as a result, it's very rarely seen at top level, as I said. So Robatsch continued with g6, aiming of course for bishop g7 and pressure against white's d-pawn. And having provoked knight c3 with queen takes d5, the d-pawn is made harder to defend because white cannot play c3 in order to bolster his center without moving the knight again first, which costs time. As well as that, black plans to play knight h6 to f5 in order to increase the pressure. And this system too had been played and enjoyed by Robatsch, who had done well with it. Here his idea of giving up the center and then attacking it is clear. Fischer, of course, had done his homework and was ready for the game with some ideas in mind of his own. Here he played bishop f4, noting that playing routinely instead with something like knight f3 permits only a minimal edge at best. For example, after bishop g7 and h3, which is a cunning move because it prevents not only bishop g4, taking away a defender of the d-pawn, but also knight h6, because now will come g4 and white has a small and comfortable edge. Another move that's not as good as Fischer's move here, bishop f4, is bishop c4, because it doesn't give white much either. After, for example, bishop g7, knight f3, knight h6, and there's looming pressure with knight f5 coming next, and white doesn't want to give up the bishop pair because the board is fairly open, so bishop takes h6 is not really a wise choice, and pushing the pawn to d5 is not an attractive option either because it becomes harder to defend the further it advances down the board. Okay, so bishop f4 anyway from Fischer, and now bishop g7 from Robatsch with good pressure now on the d4 pawn, and it's important to get the move order correct here too. If instead knight h6, now bishop e5 attacking the rook, is annoying and forces concessions from black with either rook g8 or f6 having to be played. So bishop g7 anyway from Robatsch, and now queen d2, which is a nice move from Fischer. How many of us would play this and simply ignore the threat on the d-pawn? It can just be snapped up here very easily, and one of the points of this move is now knight h6 can't be played because it's simply taken, and immediately his strategy of giving up the center and then attacking it has to be abandoned, which brings into question his entire opening choice. And something else that's worth considering here is knight b5, which looks tempting with pressure on c7, but and it also defends d4, but it's weak because black can simply play knight a6 followed up with c6 and defend easily, whilst white must still be concerned about his d-pawn, and in the meantime he's lost the edge he was accumulating and moved the same piece twice in the opening, which, as we've already seen, is generally, but not always, a bad idea. Another choice that's suboptimal in this position is knight f3, because this permits black the setup he desires after knight h6 with knight f5 and pressure on d4 coming next. So queen d2 anyway from Fischer, and here Robatsch played knight f6, and as indicated he's forced to abandon his opening idea with knight h6 to f5, and thus must play more routinely, and he's given up the center in the meantime, which is obviously no good. The importance of the center is one of the main principles of chess. But what if he had accepted the offered pawn instead? Let's have a look. If queen takes d4, which can be considered the main line if the pawn's going to be accepted, best play continues queen takes d4, bishop takes d4, and now knight b5, attacking both the bishop and the c7 pawn. So bishop b6 is forced, where after knight takes c7, bishop takes c7, and bishop takes c7, white can claim an enduring edge with the bishop pair and queenside pawn majority, and Fischer felt that white had all the winning chances from this position forwards. Another way to accept the pawn was with bishop takes d4. But this is even worse than before, because after simply castling long, attacking the bishop again, comes knight c6 to defend it, and now bishop b5, pinning the defender, and bishop d7, breaking the pin in a cunning manner. If you want to try and find the correct move here for white, then stop the video now. Knight d5 is the move that maintains the edge for white. If instead bishop takes c6, bishop takes c6, queen takes d4, black has queen takes d4, rook takes d4, and bishop takes g2 with a winning edge. So knight d5 is the correct move, and now black is getting into trouble. He has to defend his bishop, so e5, and now knight f3 followed up with rook h e1 gives white a big advantage. Fischer felt that from here black would not get out of the opening alive, and it's instructive analysis from Fischer that shows clearly the merits of playing dynamically and, through calculation, being unconcerned with dropping pawns when there is clear compensation a few moves down the line. Okay, so back to the game continuation, which is knight f6 from Robatsch. And here Fischer castled long, which is defending the d-pawn securely and preparing bishop h6 in order to trade off black's dark square bishop, which is another of the ideas in Fischer's early bishop f4, as well as enabling this queenside castling. Robatsch continued with c6, which prevents any knight b5 ideas and disencourages d5 push from white. Fischer felt that knight d5 was a better try for equality, noting that after bishop e5, the best move, if instead bishop h6, then bishop takes h6, queen takes h6, and knight takes c3, fractures the white pawns and so is undesirable. So bishop e5, castles, h4, h5, and knight g e2. White does have an edge, but nothing too dangerous or forcing or certainly winning just yet. So c6 from Robatsch. And now bishop h6 from Fischer, aiming to exchange off the bishop g7 as indicated, and it can now be said that white has won the opening battle, as from herein the advantage is palpable, especially after Robatsch's next move, which was castling, which is certainly a case of castling into an attack. It would have been wiser to play bishop takes h6, and after queen takes h6, bishop f5, striving to castle long and setting up a little trap. If queen g7 here, hoping to disrupt the black pieces, attacking the rook, black has rook g8, which is going to trap the queen after queen h6, and g5 with rook g6, sealing the trap, coming next. So Robatsch castled, and now comes h4 from Fischer, which is pawn storming into the black king in order to open attacking lines, which is the standard strategy with opposite sides castling. Robatsch continued with queen a5, aiming to help defend his king side and also as prophylaxis against the c3 knight moving thanks to the pressure on a2, and he'll be aiming to pawn storm himself, and so the queen from this square will be able to assist in the attack on the white king too. The position now shares many features with a Sicilian dragon setup, which is an opening that Fischer routinely ripped to shreds, and so he is very much within his comfort zone already. Taking no prisoners, he advanced unmercifully with h5, offering a pawn for the second time in the game, and this time Robatsch accepted with g takes h5, which is a horrible move to have to play and certainly gives white a big edge, but black is obliged to keep the h file closed if he wants to survive the black attack. Alternatives are less palatable. For example, If rook d8, now h takes g6 and h takes g6, sorry, f takes g6, h takes g6 instead is suicidal after bishop takes g7, queen h6 check, etc. So bishop takes g7, king takes g7, queen h6 check, king g8, and now knight f3 with knight g5 coming next, and white is winning easily. Another failed defense is knight takes h5, because now comes bishop e2, knight f6, bishop takes g7, king takes g7, queen h6 check, king g8, and now g4, where black can't take, of course, because the knight is tied to defending h7. One line, for example, goes rook d8, now g5, knight h5, bishop takes h5, g takes h5, rook takes h5, and now bishop f5 to defend h7. If instead queen f5, now g6, where black's only real hope to hold out for as long as he can is queen takes g6, but now rook g5 wins the queen. So bishop f5 is better, but now g6 wins it for white, because the bishop can't capture because it's pinned to the queen, and black, his only other option to avoid getting mated is f takes g6, but now rook e1, or simply queen takes h7 check, king f8, and now rook e1, stopping the king from escaping via e6 is easily winning for white, and in fact a forced mate in 8 moves from this position. Instead of g takes h5, a third defense that fails is bishop takes f5, where white is winning after f3, threatening g4, and here black can try bishop takes h6. If instead g takes h5, now queen g5 wins it for white, because it threatens mate on g7, and there's no bishop g6 because the bishop is once again pinned to the queen, and black is forced to play knight e8 to defend the mate, but now g4 exploits the pin once more. So bishop takes h6 is better, and now queen takes h6, which threatens all kinds of nasties and again sets lots of traps. For example, if g takes h5, now queen g5 check, king h8, and bishop d3 wins a piece, again thanks to the pin on the bishop. So those are some of the alternatives to g takes h5, which are all clearly worse. So at this point white's attack is very strong, and Robatsch is going to have to play extremely accurately and well to fend it off. So after g takes h5, Fischer played bishop d3, which is defending the f5 square and preventing bishop f5, and that would be a nice square for the bishop, because then it can come to g6 and play a defensive role and be a useful defensive piece. So Robatsch continued instead with knight b d7. If he plays bishop f5 instead and queen g5, and we have the same problems as before, it's winning at least a piece. So knight b d7, and now knight g e2, bringing up reserve troops so all pieces can participate in the attack. And white now has a comfortable advantage of well over a pawn, and the loss of the h pawn is inconsequential considering the power of the upcoming attack. Robatsch continued with the rook d8, which gives his king some breathing space, and it's logical to move his rook to the semi-open d-file. So how to continue the attack now? If you want to try and spot Fischer's move, then stop the video here. g4 is what he played, which is the third pawn sacrifice of the game, and another nice one. Robatsch declined with knight f8, hoping to cluster minor pieces around his king in order to defend. Let's have a look and see what would happen if he had accepted. If knight takes g4, rook d g1, threatening both f3 where the knight can't move, or its awesome attack on g7. And it's also threatening rook takes g4, which is going to create a game-winning attack. So that's obviously no good. So instead of knight takes g4, there was h takes g4, and now bishop takes g7 is completely winning after king takes g7, queen h6 check, and a forced mate. And this is why the h file must stay closed. To hold out the longest, black has to play king h8, but now comes bishop takes h7, knight f8, bishop g6 with discovered check from the queen, knight 8, h7, now bishop takes h7, and black is forced into suicidal moves such as queen h5 in order to delay the mate. So it's very nice play from Fischer once again. So knight f8 anyway from Robatsch, and now g takes h5, and the opening of the g file will prove very strong for white's attack. And look at these black pieces, they're at very passive and defensive squares. There's no chance for counterplay at all. And Robatsch was content to defend for a while, and here he played knight e6. And it should be noted too that playing instead knight takes h5 is an outright blunder after rook d g1, threatening rook takes h5 and bishop takes g7. So knight g6, but now comes bishop takes g7, king takes g7, and rook g5, attacking both the queen and the knight, and winning at the very least a piece. So knight e7, and now rook d g1, and at this point, if not before, Robatsch must have begun to feel the pressure, and despite that he defended very accurately throughout, with king h8 first of all breaking the pin, and thanks to his knight e6 he's now able to play after bishop takes g7, knight takes g7, which keeps his king out of the firing line. But now comes queen h6, which is threatening mate on g7 and immobilizing the f6 knight thanks to the pressure on h7 from the queen and the bishop. And all Robatsch played was a couple of slightly inaccurate moves. His queen a5 was perhaps suboptimal, and suddenly he's faced with a crushing attack. It's very precise and accurate attacking from Fischer. So he has to defend g7 here anyway, and he played rook g8. If he moves the knight instead with something like knight e6, now knight f4, deflecting the e6 knight from defense of g7, and the mate threat there will force mate. And black doesn't have to take the knight, of course, but the tied up position of his pieces means that he'll be losing material very quickly, and shortly after that, of course, the game. So rook g8 anyway from Robatsch, and now rook g5 from Fischer, and white's initiative grows and grows, and this attacks the black queen and thus allows white to effectively double rooks on the g-file in one move. And Robatsch again played the best move, queen d8, and after moving 4 times, the queen is now back on its starting square. It's ridiculous, really. Another good reason not to play the Scandinavian. And now rook hg1, and suddenly the black pieces are helplessly tied up. Neither of these knights can move, and black has to defend g7 somehow, and the only real way to achieve it is with queen f8. However, at this moment, facing enormous pressure, Robatsch blundered with knight f5. He had to try instead queen f8, where Fischer gave the winning line in his analysis as d5, where best play goes bishop d7. If instead c takes d5, now knight takes d5, where there's no knight takes d5, or black will be mated on h7. And knight f6 with the same idea of mating on h7 is coming next, and black is helpless against it. The best he can do is bishop f5, but now knight takes f6, and after bishop takes d3, knight takes g8. It's hopelessly lost. So bishop d7 would be better here. But now comes d6, which is undermining the defense of the f6 knight. And black is not totally lost here. He can play knight f5, but after some exchanges there's a sting in the tail with queen f8 and rook a takes f8. If instead rook g takes f8 and bishop takes f5 simply is winning a piece. So rook a takes f8, and now bishop takes f5, and rook takes g5, rook takes g5. h6 is forcing the rook away from the defense of the bishop, and it's going to win back the piece, but only temporarily, because white has d takes e7 here, attacking the black rook in turn. So if h takes g5, then e takes f8, and it's obviously winning. So say for example rook b8, but now white has rook g3, so that after bishop takes f5 there's rook f3, and white will remain a piece ahead and win the game easily, although black puts up a lot more resistance in comparison to Robatsch's blunder with knight f5 at this stage, because here simply bishop takes f5 and black has lost a piece. And it's just incredible that Fischer could put the best players in the world under so much pressure that they would blunder in such a fashion. And after this move, only Fischer's 20th of the game, Robatsch resigned, and the popularity of the Scandinavian defence plummeted to depths from which it never fully resurfaced. The point of this move is that there's no bishop takes f5 thanks to rook takes g8 check, where if knight takes g8, queen g7 is mate, so queen takes g8 is forced, but of course black is totally busted after rook takes g8, rook takes g8 and queen e3, and he's playing with a rook against a queen. So it was a fantastic game from Fischer, whose aggression and attacking abilities shine through brilliantly, and not only his pawn sacrifices but also his undermining of Robatsch's preparation was very instructive. We can have a quick replay with the threatened squares highlighted, just so we can see it from start to finish. So the Scandinavian, a unusual choice really from Robatsch. It's rarely seen at top level these days, as I said, and one of those reasons is because it breaks fundamental rules, and it's just not black's best try for equality. Playing e5 in response to e4 is probably better, not to mention the Sicilian, of course, which is probably black's best fighting chance against e4 as the first move. And in the notes to this game, one comment was that Fischer's play here is reminiscent of Morphy, the ease with which he seems to crush his grandmaster opponent in 20 moves. It's 5 moves less than it takes to make a miniature is just incredible. And as we can see here, his development and his attacking initiative is just too much for Robatsch to deal with. So I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave any comments or thoughts. Thanks very much.